Hello, and welcome to a special GZERO live stream presentation, Transforming Education. I'm Andrew Jack, Global Education Editor of the Financial Times, and oversee our free High Schools Access programme. Our programme today is part of the Global Stage series, brought to you in partnership between GZERO Media and Microsoft. As the 77th United Nations General Assembly gets underway, the world is facing converging crises, from climate change to military conflict and a still ongoing COVID pandemic. These factors have created deep setbacks for development goals like poverty eradication, fighting extreme hunger, and education, which is the focus of our live stream today. The COVID pandemic disrupted education for an estimated 1.6 billion students around the world. The UN reports that nearly 150 million of them lost out on at least half of their in-person schooling since 2020. We've assembled an all-star panel of experts and private sector leaders to discuss the deep impact this disruption has caused and how to fix it moving forward. We begin today with Evelyn DeJesus, Executive Vice President of the American Federation of Teachers, and Leonardo Garnier, the UN Secretary General's top advisor on the Transforming Education Summit taking place this week. Welcome to you both.
Thank you.
Leo, I want to start with you. So in a keynote address that you delivered this summer, you said, we're not even close to reaching SDG 4, the Sustainable Development Goal, around quality education for all. Give us the overview of where we stood globally on the goal before the pandemic in March 2020 and where it stands today.
Hello, Andrew, and thanks for the invitation to be part of this conversation. Let me start by recognizing that after the terrible impact of the education of the 1980s crisis, the world, and especially lower and middle income countries, started to improve in their education investments during the first decades of this century. These improvements, however, were not significant enough in terms of the existing situation and the ambitious and yet very simple challenges of SDG 4, which aims to, and I quote, ensure inclusive and equitable quality education and promote lifelong learning opportunities for all. As simple as it sounds, for most developing countries, this goal remained a distant one even before the pandemic. First, it was distant in terms of mere access. It is estimated that at least 260 million children were completely out of school before the pandemic. I know big numbers are not easy to grasp. That's almost 4 times the total number of children in the USA, 17 times the number of children in Japan, 26 times the number of children in Germany, or 54 times the number of children in Australia, completely out of school. But it is even more dramatic in terms of effective learning. In 2019, it was estimated that 57% of 10-year-olds in low and middle-income countries were unable to read and understand a simple story. Now, with the impact of the pandemic, it's been estimated that around 70% of children in these countries will not be able to read and understand a basic text by age 10. And this is not only a problem in poor countries, but a similar situation also affects children from poor families and neighborhoods in several high-income countries like the US, reflecting a growing educational inequality. Of course, this has to do with insufficient educational investment. The commonly used benchmarks for education spending are to reach 4 to 6% of GDP or 15 to 20% of total government expenditure. Those indicators had improved slightly in recent decades, but fell again during the pandemic. But percentages are not enough. To really understand how far we are from what we should be doing in education, let's look just at how much each country is investing per school-age person. High-income countries spend on average about $8,000 a year per school-age person. $8,000. Next, upper middle-income countries invest about $1,000. Lower middle-income countries, only about $300. And quite at the bottom, lower-income countries are merely able to invest $50 per year per school-age person. These international disparities are compounded by disturbing educational inequalities within countries, where the benefits of educational investment do not usually reach those who need it the most. the pandemic and the ongoing global economic crisis make these gaps and inequalities even harder to confront. That's the picture at this time.
And we'll talk in a little bit about solutions and next steps post the summit. But just sort of setting the scene, you've talked about the challenges even before the pandemic. I mean, is that largely about financing? Do you think the gaps that explain why progress was already slow, or are there some other structural factors that you think have been holding back longer term aspirations to get towards that achievement of quality education?
It's complicated because it would be easy to say it's a question of financing, and usually we talk about the political will, whether there is or there isn't enough political will to finance this, or whether a country is too poor. I think that especially when you look at the situation in less developed countries, or poor or lower income, or whatever the name you want to use, the problem is that even if there is huge amounts of research showing that investing in education pays, even in economic terms, even for increasing growth or for increasing income in the future. As you say, there is this structural problem. I would simply call it the poverty trap. When you have a country with a lot of cheap labor, a big supply of very cheap labor, the kind of investments that usually tend to come to those countries or emerge in those countries are investments whose profits depend not on increasing productivity, not in sophisticated technology, and of course not in a highly educated labor force, but precisely on those wages being low. So you don't have this virtuous cycle of increasing productivity and increasing wages. You have the opposite. You have a cycle where low productivity goes with low wages, and those two things go with not investing in education. In such a poverty trap, investing in education is perceived by the economy as a waste of money. And that's a trap you have to break if you really want to invest in education.
So we'll think a bit more about solutions in a minute. But Evelyn, I want to ask you about the impact specifically in the United States. Recent national test results revealed that math and reading scores for 9-year-olds fell by the largest margin in 30 years. Why is that?
So thank you for having me, and thank you, Andrew, for this question. The short answer is that for the last 2.5 years, we've had ongoing, unprecedented, intersecting national traumas. I'm not saying that that's an excuse. Kids need to understand. Math and how to read. This is true, but it is truth. And 9-year-olds were not immune from this. Millions of people died. There were kids that loved those people. More than 200,000 kids had 200,000 kids have gotten lost, have lost family members, have died. So imagine the social and emotional piece of it. Hospitals were full. In New York City, where I'm from, you could hear sirens around the clock. Schools shut down. People were scared. Fear was rampant. Kids experienced that fear. The economy crashed and parents lost their jobs. Other parents, frontline workers, had to keep working in the midst of this pandemic, fearful every day for their own lives and the lives of their families. So, of course, normal schooling was interrupted, and remote instruction, especially for children, was there. It is no substitute for in-person learning. If you talk to any parent who had their kids at home for any significant part of these past 2.5 years, you know what I'm talking about. Teachers and parents have worked incredibly hard throughout this period. But the burnout that adults have been talking about for the past 2 years is real, and kids are feeling it too. It would have been a miracle if test scores hadn't dropped tremendously in this time. We all knew what was going on. Our major focus, as you're saying, to bring solution, our major focus this year in the classrooms will be building students up, providing them with social and emotional support, and accelerating their learning so that they are ready to succeed in school and beyond.
And you mentioned the failures of remote learning. what do you think could have been done to improve that experience?
Well, so I think that was a huge part of it. Students and educators and parents, everyone was thrown into an unfamiliar situation, which, with zero time to prepare. And millions of students and families didn't have access to high-speed internet, which was a huge problem all over the world. We have been talking about the digital divide for decades, but not doing anything about it as a nation. People did their best, providing hotspots and tablets for kids, but the country was playing catch up, and Black and brown and low income and rural kids paid the price. Now, thank goodness that the Biden administration is putting real money, did you know, $65 billion toward making sure that every American has access to affordable, reliable, high-speed internet. I hope it doesn't happen again. But I do think we are better prepared for remote learning. We figured out the technology. We figured out how to get people connected. Educators found ways to make their virtual classrooms engaging, safe, and ready to learn.
So did education become too much of a political football in the US during the pandemic, Evelyn?
What a question. Everybody knows the answer to that. Absolutely, Andrew. And it's only gotten worse. Extremist politicians are trying to drive a wedge between our parents, our teachers, by banning books, censoring curriculum, and politicizing public education. What we're doing instead is spreading literacy and the love of reading, the love of learning, giving out books, not banning them. A lot of people don't know this, but American Federation of Teachers released a report in April of 2019. Just a few weeks into the pandemic, we showed exactly how to open schools for in-person learning in a safe way, using all the information and science we had at the time. The problem wasn't that teachers weren't willing to do it, despite all the right-wing union bashing that's become so fashionable. The previous administration simply wouldn't step up. States and districts and schools wouldn't step up to provide conditions to make it safe. And they blamed who? The teachers for their own inaction. So while right-wing politicians were pitting safety and in-person learning against each other as competing interests, we were using our expertise in schools and the expertise of public health experts to create a roadmap to get back into schools and making them safe and the community safe.
And a really important message about the fundamental role of teachers. So, but Leo, in New York, the Transforming Education Summit's just coming up. What's the message and what's the goal?
Well, if we really believe that education is a human right, then, as I said, every person in the planet should have access to the knowledge, the skills, the values, the capacities to lead a meaningful, productive, and enjoyable life in this complex and highly unequal world. We're obviously not there. And as I said before, we're not even getting closer. That is why the Secretary General convened this Transforming Education Summit, mainly to put education at the top of the political table and to call for its transformation. And what do we mean by transformation? I'll mention 5 key areas we have been talking about in the summit. One, we need inclusive and engaging schools. This is a challenge of access in terms of having enough schools and teachers for the children, but also in terms of dismantling all discriminatory norms, policies, practices that prevent some groups to effectively accessing the school systems. We need schools as safe and caring places for learning and for sharing. That's one. 2, has to do with the content, which needs to be relevant, and with the methods of learning. In many countries and regions, today's education is not just fit for purpose. Students are not even learning the basics of literacy, numeracy, scientific thinking, but they are not developing their emotional and interpersonal skills, which are critical, as Evelyn mentioned. But they are also not learning what is relevant for living in today's challenging world, about sustainable development, about climate crisis, about conflict. So it's really a problem of relevance. Of course, and this is a third point, we need more and better prepared teachers. They have to be capable of leading their students into effective and increasingly autonomous learning. Today, teachers are undertrained, undervalued, underpaid, problems that we must solve if we want to develop the teaching force our students need. Four is one thing that also Evelyn was mentioning. We have to harness the digital revolution for widening access and for improving the kind of creative learning we need. The pandemic was, in this respect, quite interesting because it showed us both the promise and the peril of digital learning. As Evelyn put it, it could be the great leveler, but also the great divider. In many countries and regions, 90% of the kids were not connected. So yes, we need global access to the internet, but that's not enough. We also need public digital learning resources. We don't want teachers using PowerPoint instead of the Blackboard, but doing the same thing as before. We have to really take advantage of the kind of digital learning resources we can have. And finally, as I said before, all this requires adequate financing. We must invest more in education. We have to invest more equitably, and we must invest more efficiently. And one thing I would like to emphasize, and we're saying a lot this in the summit, is that this depends basically on domestic public budgets. Of course, international aid is very important, especially for the poorest countries. But for many countries, public budgets mean about 97% of educational investment. The only way in which countries will be able to increase their educational investment is through ambitious and progressive revamping of their tax systems. And as you asked before, here the problem is that the balance of power in many of our countries make it very difficult to go for progressive taxes, as finally it's becoming to be mentioned. I think that financing education should be seen as an ethical imperative, but if we are wise enough, it should also be seen as the best economic investment. It's ethically perverse, but it's economically absurd. It cuts precisely that investment on which future economic growth would depend. So as I said before, you have to break free from those poverty traps and finance education for the kids and for the economy.
So Eurasia Group and GZERO Media President Ian Bremmer recently interviewed UN Secretary General Antonio Guterres. Here's some of what he had to say about the need for transformation in education.
To learn things is less and less important. To learn how to learn is more and more important. But that makes the need for educational systems, for the teachers, the way they are trained, for the equipment that is available, namely digital equipment, for all that, for the capacity to work in teams, it is a revolution. Conceiving an educational system in which what is the main objective is to develop the capacity of the students and not to just throw things for the students to learn by heart. And many of the educational systems we have in the world are still not yet there. And so we need a massive investment in education to correct the inequalities that exist. We need to have broadband in all schools everywhere. We need to have a digital access everywhere in all schools, but we need a transformative approach of education in order to make education an instrument to prepare people for a world that we don't know how it will be. And education systems are not yet there, and they must be there. And this is a huge effort we would like to give a strong impulse in our summit. And then education is still in our mind something for young people. We need lifelong learning. We need permanent education. We need to adapt ourselves to things that are changing very quickly. And what we have learned in the past will not be what we will need in the future. So an educational system focused on developing capacities, and an educational system focused on accompanying citizens all over their lives are two essential transformations that we would like to impulse.
Evelyn, your reaction to what we heard from the Secretary General?
Well, Andrew, I say that the American Federation of Teachers fully supports everything the Secretary General is advocating for. In fact, he sounds a whole lot like my president, President Randy Weingarten. Every single one of his critical areas are fundamental to what we do and what we advocate, from equity and inclusivity to project-based learning and boosting public investment in education. And finally, after 4 decades of austerity budgets at state and federal levels and politicians' endless lectures to educators about belt tightening, we are seeing a new paradigm in which President Biden's administration sees real investments in American education as a fundamental pillar of a growing, equitable, and sustainable economy.
Leo, what specifically can the United Nations do to get this development goal, SDG 4, back on track?
I think there are like different streams. There is one side that has to do with the vision about education, and the Secretary General was referring to the Delors report that was a UNESCO report from a few years ago that still sounds in our minds. He said, you have learning to learn, learning to do, learning to live together, learning to be. Those remain as like the main objectives of education. But as being more specific at what can the UN do, one, which is one of the purposes of the summit, is galvanizing political will, bringing heads of state to this summit and having them commit to education. What is it that you are going to do for your kids' education? And as I said before, not just in terms of percentages of GDP or percentages of national budgets, but how much are you going to invest in each one of your boys, girls, young and not so young persons? That's critical. Also, the transformative view of education, as the Secretary General was mentioning in the interview, we have to understand that education is not just education for work. It's education for life. You have to learn how to solve problems. You have to learn how to do that in collaboration with others. It's not just about competition and who wins, who loses. It's about living together. It's about understanding the critical situation of the planet and how that has to do, on the one hand, with science and how science can help us to solve the problem, but it also has to do with how we live together in this world. How do we solve our conflicts? How do we share the resources of this planet with more solidarity? Learning to live together is quite a difficult thing. We put a lot of emphasis in how do we learn math? How do we learn science? How do we learn language? No, we have to learn how to live together. That has to be in the curricula. Many of these actions will be national. And here, just to end the idea, we need national governments to get involved with this transformation of education. And for that, you need a global movement. You need the kids, you need the teachers, you need the civil society pressuring their countries to make real the kind of education we need.
Prior to this live stream, GZERO Media asked followers across its social channels poll questions about the topics and themes we're exploring today. Here's the first. Disrupted education has most impacted learning and academic growth, mental health, or socialization skills. And here's a look at how you voted. Learning and academic growth at 36%, mental health at 32%, and socialization skills at 32%. Evelyn and Leo, I'd like to ask you to both react to that question. Beyond learning, social and emotional well-being have been impacted. So what are the potential long-term consequences of that? Evelyn.
So again, our nation and the world have gone through some collective traumas. We must recognize this is to properly move forward. Students need to feel safe and supported. Educators know how to do that. They need to feel connected with the community. And lots of people will tell you definitely what the long-term consequences will be. They want to convince regular people that institutions are failing, that governments does more harm than good, that public schools are both the problem because they close and the problem because they exist. The truth is this: We don't know what the long-term consequences will be, but we know what the solutions are. They are the same solutions to the problems we had before the start of this pandemic. We know that kids' basic needs have to be met so they can make the academic progress we want to see. So we need to make sure that kids are housed, they're fed, they're safe. And once they get to school, that they need to feel safe and supported. The good news is that we know what works. Fully staffing schools, providing resources, ensuring kids have access to the help they need, whether it is healthcare, eyeglasses, counseling, or tablets. And again, thanks to President Biden's American Rescue Plan, there is more money to do this than we've had in 2 generations. The bad news is that we've known what kids and communities needed long before these past few years. The problem is that until Joe Biden became president, there just wasn't enough political will for it.
Leo, a brief reaction from you on the poll result?
Well, I agree that that's what I would have expected from such a survey. Equally drastic effects on learning, on mental health, and in socialization skills. And this only goes to show that schools are much more than content machines. They are the place and time for personal growth in its fullest sense. And as I said before, for interacting with others, for caring. I think it is very important for us when we see this kind of impact to think not only of the potential long-term consequences of the pandemic, but rather on how to use this terrible experience in a constructive educational way. How do we help our kids to learn about resiliency, about empathy, about cooperation? How do we make this tough experience a learning experience for them? These learnings are as important, if not more important, than the traditional academic elements we associate with schools. And they don't happen by chance. They have to be carefully included in the curricula, in the daily workings of every school. So yes, they have to have the resources, not just the blackboard, to be places for learning how to live and how to cope.
Now, last year, the UN released a staggering estimate. Some 11 million girls globally may never return to school after the pandemic. Ian Bremmer spoke to the former executive director of UN Women from Zile Malomba Ngozu. Here's what she had to say.
When you look at what's happened with the pandemic and the response, how has that affected your job? How has that affected your outlook on the world for women?
It's certainly been a setback. I mean, it was not like we had made grand progress, but the limited progress is being compromised. Women in the labor market, we could be going back to a situation where a woman's place is at home and a man's place is at work. That needs policy interventions in order for countries to be conscious about not developing an architecture of the labor market that is for men. Girls' education, we had made not perfect progress, but it was going the right way in many countries. The many children who did not go back to school after the pandemic in many countries are girls, and they have not gone back in some cases because of pregnancies, which is not from consensual sex, increase in trafficking, increase in child marriage. We estimate that about 11 million girls would not go back to school after the pandemic. So that's a big setback.
Leo, has that situation for girls improved? And what more needs to be done globally to improve education for women and girls?
Yeah, Andrew, for us, men, is quite difficult to understand the terribly unbalanced relation between men and women that pervades all aspects of life and education in particular. This imbalance starts from the day we're born. It has to do with the toys we receive to play with, how our parents or other adults talk to us, from the expectations they instill in us from the earliest days, and then it only gets worse. In extreme situations like the ones we've mentioned, by outright exclusion from formal education, which is absolutely unacceptable. Fortunately, with a few terrible exceptions like Afghanistan, this has been changing positively in most countries. Girls' enrollment equals and in some cases even surpasses that of boys. Boys also face problems of their own, like having to abandon high school in order to bring home some income. But even when girls are in school, in high school, or go to the university, as they are doing in increasing numbers, they're not studying the same professions as men. And even when they do, they don't receive the same treatment as we do. Let's use the educational profession as an example. The teaching profession is highly feminine. Most teachers are women, but the professional development of male and female teachers is quite different. In preschool, almost all teachers are female. In primary school, not all, but most of them are women, while the proportion tends to be reversed in better paying high school jobs. And when we look at positions of power, most schools' masters or principals are men. The same happens in many professions. To receive equal treatment, women must be much better qualified, smarter, and work much harder than men. And even then, they hardly make it to the top. And when they do it, it is at a terrible personal cost. And yes, this is about education, but of course, it is also about power. Education is embedded in a specific social context, and it is part of the reproduction of power structures. On the positive side, as Paulo Freire and many others have argued for many years, education could play a subversive role, a transformative role in terms of making us feel uncomfortable with those unbalanced relations, helping us, and especially helping girls, recognize that when we have a right that is denied to others, that is not a right, that is a privilege. If it does that, education could be contributing to create a new culture, new norms, new balances of power, a better way of living together. But for that to happen, again, we need a movement. We need the participation of young people, of women, of girls, and people of color, pressuring for this equal treatment in education so that we can have a better society.
Evelyn, I see you're nodding enthusiastically. I'm afraid we've run out of time for this segment, but I'd like to thank both you, Evelyn, DeJesus, and Leo Garnier. Thanks so much for your time and your input on this incredibly important issue.
Thank you for having us.
A pleasure. Thank you. Nice to meet Evelyn.
Thank you.
We have lots to unpack from all that we've just discussed, including the role technology plays in all of this and what the political and economic implications are of the great education disruption. Joining me now are Gerald Butts, Vice Chairman of Eurasia Group, and Vickie Robinson, General Manager of Microsoft's Airband initiative. Welcome to you both. We've heard quite a bit from both of our expert guests today already. I want to give you each a chance to call out what struck you most from our previous segment. Jerry?
Well, look, I think the most important learning to take away from all this is that people have been through an extraordinarily disruptive and difficult time, and kids have felt that around the world more than just about anyone. I think we can quantify, and I'm sure we'll get into this in the discussion, Andrew, the economic impact of this over the short, medium, and long term. But for those of us who are watching who have children or happen to be on the panel who have children, none of what we heard is any surprise.
And Vickie, a standout message for you from our first part of discussion here today?
There's a lot to unpack, but I would say as a digital inclusion advocate, but most importantly, as a mother of high school children, I think the point that stands out most to me, the biggest challenge, is the number of kids who may never return to school. And the number, when you think about 11 million girls who will not likely return to school as a result of the great education disruption, that has huge implications, not just around our efforts to improve quality of education and lifelong opportunities, but also gender inequality, which is something that we've been battling before and we continue to try to get after, but progressing from that, just long-term economic opportunities. And so it's a lot, it's a big challenge, but we have to get after it.
So Vickie, in the last 2 years, we've seen an exponential growth in and dependence on technology in education and remote learning. Can you give us a sense of the role technology has played for those who had connectivity and for those who didn't?
Sure, Andrew. I think One of the great things about the pandemic, at least from my perspective, is that it certainly accelerated digitization. And with that acceleration, you see the potential of technology being unlocked. Unfortunately, with that digitization, we also saw magnify the gap between those who have access to technology and are connected to the internet, and then those who do not. And this has real ramifications for the educational space. And so with the pandemic and school closings, whereas children before were able to at least get access to some level of education and exposure to technology in the best case scenario in the school environment, all of that changed drastically as the world closed and those schools closed, and you had a situation in which you had children, including my own children, who were able to continue on with learning because we had in-home connectivity. And this provided, I would say, for our family, an enormous amount of benefit from the children as my own children transitioned from middle school and on to high school and were able to have some sense of normalcy by being able to participate in online learning. Unfortunately, 2/3 of school-age children did not have and don't have in-home connectivity. And as a result, they were cut off from learning and that sense of community and normalcy. And we know from the data that many of those children who did not have access to technology and in-home connectivity, millions of them will not return to school. And that's a scary prospect for us to go after. And so just unpacking that a bit more, we know that many of those children that did not have in-home connectivity and were not able to participate in digital learning, they tend to be from marginalized communities, people who are income insecure, people of color, girls, members of the disability community. And so it's a huge benefit to be able to participate in digital economy through access to technology and being connected online. But there is a lot more work for us to do so that we can ensure that everyone can share in that equally and reap the benefits of digitization and technology.
So let's talk about that divide. Jerry, in what ways do you see the global equality gap growing because of these educational setbacks, and what could result?
Thanks, Andrew. That's a great question. And one of the things that we've been looking at since really just the beginning of the pandemic, we at Eurasia Group expected the pandemic to act as an accelerant for pre-existing trends that had some positives, digital adoption of digitization, as Vickie was talking about. And parenthetically, I'd just say, a lot of people are having understandable angst about the amount of time their kids are spending on screens, but we should also consider the counterfactual, what this pandemic education experience would have been like had we not had all of this advanced technology. Had this pandemic struck when I was in high school in the late 1980s, it would have been a very, very different educational experience. But getting back to your question, I think this was covered a lot in the panel that preceded mine and Vickie's remarks, but it's important to note that it exacerbated divisions, both economic disparities, both within countries, and Vickie talked a lot about that, particularly being harmful for marginalized groups within Western democracies, but it also exacerbated disparities between countries. So one of the things that we're concerned about at Eurasia Group is if people lose economic opportunities because they have diminished educational attainment, then that will lead to disruptive politics around the world and disrupted geopolitics between countries. This is something that we should all be quite concerned about as a direct consequence of the pandemic.
It's time now for our second viewer poll. Here's the question. Since the pandemic, my child's reliance on technology has increased, reduced, or stayed about the same? And here's what our viewers had to say. It increased 85%, reduced 3%, stayed about the same 12%. So a huge impact of increased influence and penetration of technology. Jerry and Vickie, stay with me. We heard the UN Secretary General say that education is also critical for adults and that lifelong learning is now the goal. I want to talk about that and turn to solutions for the issues we've discussed today. Jonathan Rochelle is Vice President of Product Management at LinkedIn and leads content and instructor experience efforts for LinkedIn Learning. Welcome.
Thank
Jonathan,
you. Thanks for having me.
So a LinkedIn report declared that the pandemic pulled the future forward in terms of skills. What does that mean?
Generally, we know that a good talent market means matching talent to opportunity, and talent means skills. And today, or in the past, traditionally, and still today, hiring for opportunities, because opportunities means jobs, is done based on too much weighting on the right schools, put that in quotes, the right schools, the right connections, the right titles, the right experience at the right companies, rather than on the skills that people have. And with the pandemic, I think the focus started shifting more to skills because the talent market became a little dry in terms of how to hire the right people. At the same time, people were being laid off from some jobs that weren't filling the jobs that were in need. So jobs that were physical were being laid off, and jobs that were virtual were in desperate need, but there was no way to match the skills. Instead, we were looking at the traditional methods that just didn't work as well. So it kind of required us to create a little bit more connection to the underlying skills. And on LinkedIn, at least, we have seen that trend grow. We've definitely seen hiring companies focus more on skills and candidates focus more on reflecting their skills in their profiles.
So, Jonathan, are you seeing this notion of lifelong learning playing out in the workforce? And if so, how?
Yeah, definitely. And we connect opportunity to skills. That's basically our core atomic unit that is both for making sure hiring companies can find the right candidates, but also to connect the learning side. And so we have solutions for companies that obviously are looking to hire. So when they're recruiting, they can find the right candidates, and then they try to do that based on skills. So more companies are doing that. We've seen 40% of companies actually start hiring based on skills, and we've seen candidates do a really great job in stating what their skills are. So about 340 million skills added this past year, which is about a 39% increase since the prior year. And the key there is to say, well, when I have a skill gap, how can I learn? So our learning product, the LinkedIn Learning product, is very focused on skill-based learning. And when we think about the education system, what you've been talking about with the other guests, it's really important that the education system attempts to focus on delivering skills, but it also starts leaning in the higher grades towards a focus on getting into the right schools, knowing that the opportunity match today is based on that. And if we focused more on actually skill attainment, then I think we can create a lot more opportunity for a lot more people. And we can do that lifelong. It's not only when you're in school. We know that the underlying issue here as well is that the skills requirements for opportunities is a moving target. It's changing drastically. And there was a report that I've seen, grow this number over the past years. But the latest I saw said 85% of the jobs in 2030 will be jobs that don't exist today. That sounds like a huge number and maybe even too large, but even if it's overestimated, when you think about what that implies for the skills that'll need to be obtained by the people looking for opportunities, it also says the higher education system can't necessarily react fast enough for that to work. So lifelong learning is going to be required. If I needed to get an opportunity right now, I couldn't depend on my degree from a couple of decades ago. It's something that I would have to attain some new skills now, and I wouldn't be able to rely on going back to a 4-year, 2-year program to get that degree. I need to have the opportunity to learn these skills now.
Jerry, we've yet to talk about higher education and college. What impact do you think the Biden administration's student loan relief plan will have? And what does America's student debt mean geopolitically compared to other developed nations where, of course, typically debts and tuition fees are lower?
Well, I think if you're amongst the group that will benefit from the relief plan, then you're going to be very happy about it. And I think what we should applaud, given what we've discussed, on the panel is that it will disproportionately target marginalized groups, that in particular Black students in the United States will benefit from Biden's student debt relief package. There's some real questions about the fact that it hasn't changed the system going forward, so that the problems that it is intended to solve may replicate themselves over time, and I think that's a challenge. The big issue, though, however, between countries or among countries is who has access to post-secondary education and who does not. I'm speaking to you from Canada, where largely because of funding reductions at the provincial level, higher education institutions in Canada have gone on a blitz to recruit students from around the world. And because of differential tuition fees, have covered the gaps in their budget largely by educating people from around the world and hoping that they'll, once they become part of the Canadian marketplace, stay within Canada with those skills. I'm not so sure long term from a geopolitical perspective that's the most equitable policy. And I think you see that to a lesser or greater degree in most developed nations, that there's a chronic need for skills, in particular in healthcare in the developing world and emerging markets. And you have rich countries that are kind of poaching their best students. And if we're looking to get back to something Leo said at the beginning, to create this virtuous circle to get nations out of poverty traps, I'm not sure that's the most positive macro trend.
So we need to perhaps support indigenous development of higher education institutions within lower and middle income countries more, in other words.
Absolutely.
So time now for our final viewer poll of the day. GZERO Media asked the following: the most important tool for global education is greater digital inclusion, increased funding and investment, or multilateral cooperation and support. Here's how the viewers voted: greater digital inclusion at 32%, increased funding at 32%, and multilateral cooperation and support, what we were just talking about, at 36% in the lead. Vickie, who's responsible for achieving greater digital inclusion? Is it tech companies, governments? How does it happen?
I think it's a shared responsibility, and this can't be a spectator sport, because there's just too much at stake for any group or part of the world to sit on the sidelines. I would say as a technology company, we believe that when your technology contributes to change in the world, you in turn bear responsibility to help the world manage through that change. And so we don't shirk from our responsibility as we look to increase access to technology from a Microsoft perspective, in our shared responsibility to ensure that more people can actually take advantage of the things and the power to transform lives that are unleashed as a result of having access to technology. And so we have a number of programs that are designed to, in fact, move toward greater digital inclusion, and particularly in the context of education. So whether it's our programs that are focused on efforts to extend and to equip schools and teachers and students with relevant digital skills, as well as critical computer science education, we're doing that work. We're also working and partnering with others to extend internet access as a way to do innovative education. And we're doing this all over the world. And in a lot of instances, delivering relevant local education digitally in transformative ways. But this is not a burden or a responsibility that should be borne by the tech sector or the private sector more generally. There is absolutely a critical role, in fact, for government in this space. Government has and should continue to lean into this. And some of the other guests have talked about efforts that we are seeing happening here in the United States with the passage of legislation that has infused billions of dollars into investment that's designed to do just this: improve access to internet in schools, but also in homes, because it's critical, because learning has to be able to continue at home, but also the devices and skills that are necessary to use this connectivity effectively. And so this has to be and is a shared responsibility for us all.
And Vickie, there are some concerns, aren't there, within the tech sector, about the tech sector, both about privacy and also about sometimes the hype, kind of non-evidence-based ed tech. Do you think the industry needs to respond in different ways with society to try and allay those fears?
I do. We have a responsibility. Again, we help to increase access to technology. And so we do need to be good corporate citizens and make sure that we are engaging in providing information and assurances around how our technology is being delivered to address these concerns, which are valid.
So, Jerry, is there hope for greater global cooperation, as we've been discussing, around education?
I think there is, Andrew, and I think it will mostly take the form of jurisdictions studying one another and figuring out what works and what doesn't. And I applaud the UN for the role that they're playing in trying to be a bit of that connective tissue, the sinews between countries and among countries to make that happen. I'm an optimist by nature, so I like to think that when given an opportunity to choose something that will obviously raise the living standards and quality of life of their citizens, that most governments will take that.
And Jonathan, what are you hearing from private sector companies and employers? What role do you think they should play?
I would love to see more cooperation, and we have certainly seen programs which are cooperations between corporate I'll call it opportunity providers with the educational system. And it's unfortunate that so much of the solutions in the space of, finding opportunities are moving digital if there's still a huge digital divide and lack of opportunity to access that. So I think one of the primary focuses should be giving access to global, equal opportunity to people globally to make sure they're represented, to say that when opportunity is there, they can say that they are there with the right skills for those opportunities. And companies are definitely interested in that. It's very hard to hire people with the right skills globally. It's true in every country. U.S. is no exception. And so we feel like we can play a part there, but obviously our opportunities are represented digitally. And so we need that open access and the ability for people, when they do get access to technology, to make sure that that's where it's applied, not just in education, but then in representing themselves as candidates for opportunities.
Time now for some final thoughts from our panelists and from me. I'd ask each of you what you hope viewers will take away from this session, starting with Jonathan.
I will say the key for us, for me, is the pivot point of skills, to really focus on attainment of skills and to make sure that as hiring managers, as people that are in the talent acquisition market, that we focus on that and that we start shifting away from the traditional, what's the right school, what's the right prior title or experience at a given company, or if you don't have the right connections, let's really focus on, do you have the skills and represent those skills through whether it's certification or proof of work. I think that's really the most critical thing, and to make sure that focus is pushed down the education system, really all the way as far as possible, so that problem solving and achieving productivity in the space that companies need is really one of the most important opportunities. And like was said earlier, not just what companies need, but what the world needs. Let's make sure people are attaining those skills and learning how to learn, so that new skills that pop up that are necessary can be attained easily. I think that's key.
Vickie, what would be your key takeaway?
There's a lot of data that has been shared as part of this very important conversation. And my hope is that people absorb the data, they don't run from it, but we use it as an incentive to take the actions that are necessary to address these problems for the long term. They are not going away. The pandemic merely showed a light on the magnitude and scale of the problems. I think one of the most important things that we can do to foster improved outcomes in education, not just for students, but for adults, to really get after and improve lifelong learning opportunities is to ensure that we're investing in digital infrastructure, which is the backbone and backdrop for the digital world. And so I hope that there will continue to be focused effort and investment toward that goal.
And Jerry, your thoughts?
Well, I'd say two things. One is that it reinforced what I think we all know, and that is that education is a fundamental building block of both healthy economies and vibrant societies, and hopefully democratic ones. Secondly, and I think was put very well by Jonathan a little while earlier, and Vickie as well, that education is a continuum, and that in primary and tertiary education, we should be teaching kids how to learn so that they can continue to learn throughout their lives. And then, as the Secretary General said, throughout their lives, we should be giving them guidance and helping them decide what to learn. But without those fundamental building blocks, you're not going to be able to acquire those vital skills that Jonathan talked about throughout your career. So education often gets talked about as an either-or proposition. You either acquire skills that are of direct value in the marketplace today, or you study more esoteric things that aren't going to translate into a job the minute you graduate. And I think that that's a false dichotomy, that both of those things are absolutely essential building blocks for education, no matter where you are in the world.
So we had a fascinating discussion with our different panelists and drawing from our polls and the wider interviews today. For me, some of the things that struck out were, first of all, of course, both the potential, but also the challenges, including the divides around technology in supporting and strengthening the scope for education. We heard about the incredibly powerful continuing role of teachers, but nonetheless, these concerns around the risk of burnout in the post-pandemic world. We heard, as Leo was mentioning at the start, that schools are so much more than simply content machines. Those wider issues of values and the passion for learning is really important. And we heard in the context of the UN summit just coming out, the importance of priorities and real commitment and financing, real key challenges and ones that there's hope, but of course a real difficulty for world leaders to get to grips with, given all the wider geopolitical context that they're facing at the moment. These and a number of other issues you'll find amongst other places in the Financial Times, where our own Investing in Education report is coming out over the next few days. So do look out for that. Jonathan Rochelle, Vickie Robertson, and Jerry Butts, thank you all very much for your participation. And join GZERO next week as they come to you live from inside the United Nations headquarters for another special program. That's next Wednesday, September the 21st, beginning at 11 a.m. Eastern. I'm Andrew Jack. Thank you all for watching and have a great afternoon.